It was an ordinary day in the courtroom, the kind of day when most people expected the usual humdrum of legal proceedings, arguments from lawyers, verdicts from judges, and a sea of faces blending into the monotony. The air inside was heavy, thick with tension, as it always is in places where decisions are made that can change lives forever. Among the crowd sat a young teenager, barely noticeable, their face a mix of nervousness and quiet determination. No one could have guessed that this unassuming figure was about to shake the room to its core. The case itself wasn't particularly shocking at first glance. A man, down on his luck, stood accused of theft. His clothes were worn, his eyes hollow, and his posture hunched under the weight of what seemed like years of hardship. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was someone who had made a mistake, and now, the system was ready to pass its judgment. The prosecutor's voice echoed sharply in the courtroom, listing the charges with an almost robotic precision. The defense attorney offered what little hope they could muster, painting a picture of desperation rather than malice. And then, it was time for the judge to deliver the final word. But before the gavel could fall, the teenager stood up. It wasn't a loud or theatrical gesture. No slamming of hands on the desk, no raised voice to demand attention. Just a simple act of rising, an almost hesitant clearing of the throat. At first, no one noticed. But when the judge, startled by the unexpected movement, turned their gaze toward the young figure, the room fell into a hushed silence. What came next was nothing short of extraordinary. With a voice trembling yet steady, the teenager began to speak. Their words were not rehearsed, not polished like those of the lawyers or the judge. They were raw, honest, and straight from the heart. They didn't deny the man's actions or make excuses for what he'd done. Instead, they offered a perspective that no one in that room had considered, a perspective so unexpected that it left everyone, from the hardened prosecutor to the weary defendant, stunned. There was something about the teenager's tone, their sincerity, that pierced through the usual barriers of skepticism and cynicism. Even the judge, known for their stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach, leaned forward, listening intently. The room seemed to hang on every word as the teenager shared a story that connected them to the man standing trial, a story that revealed a truth so profound it couldn't be ignored. And then, as quickly as it began, the teenager stopped. Their final words echoed softly in the stillness, leaving the courtroom frozen in a collective breath of disbelief. What was this story? Why did this teenager, who had no apparent connection to the case, feel compelled to speak? And most importantly, what would the judge do now? The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions. No one in that room could have predicted what was about to happen next. But one thing was clear: this teenager's surprising act of kindness had changed everything. What they said didn't just challenge the courtroom's view of justice. It challenged the way everyone there saw humanity itself. And as the judge prepared to respond, all eyes turned toward the bench, waiting for the moment that would decide not just one man's fate, but perhaps much more. Would you like me to expand this further, or does this set the tone you're looking for? The courtroom remained still, as if frozen in time, every pair of eyes fixed on the teenager who had just spoken. The judge's expression was unreadable, their gavel still resting unused. A murmur rippled through the audience, quiet but unmistakable, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Everyone was asking the same question in their minds. Who was this kid, and why did their words carry so much weight? To understand what had just happened, you'd have to rewind to the beginning. The teenager, Alex, wasn't anyone special in the way people typically imagine. No celebrity background, no remarkable achievements to their name. Just an ordinary high school student navigating the complexities of adolescence. They had the same struggles most teens did, balancing schoolwork, friendships, and figuring out who they were. But behind Alex's quiet demeanor was a heart that always seemed to notice things others didn't. The man on trial, Mr. Carter, had crossed paths with Alex before, though not in a way anyone in the courtroom could have guessed. It wasn't a dramatic encounter or one of those moments you'd see in a movie. It was small, almost forgettable, like so many moments that often go unnoticed. A few months prior, Alex had seen him outside a local grocery store. He wasn't asking for help or making a scene. He was just sitting there, looking lost in thought, clutching a crumpled paper bag. Something about him had caught Alex's attention. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight, or how his eyes seemed both distant and pleading at the same time. At the time, Alex didn't do much, just offered a smile and a nod as they walked by. But that fleeting interaction stuck with them. Over the weeks that followed, Alex started noticing Mr. Carter more often around town. Sometimes he was at the park, sitting on the same worn-out bench. Other times, he'd be at the library, leafing through old newspapers or quietly reading in a corner. He never seemed to ask for anything, but there was a sadness about him that Alex couldn't ignore. One day, curiosity got the better of them. Alex approached him cautiously, unsure of what to say. "Hi," they began, their voice tentative. "I see you around a lot. Are you okay?" Mr. Carter had looked up, startled. For a moment, Alex thought he might brush them off, but then his face softened. He didn't share much that day, just that things hadn't been easy for him lately. He'd lost his job a year ago, and life had spiraled out of control since then. Alex didn't press for details, but they listened intently, offering small words of encouragement where they could. That brief conversation turned into a few more over the weeks. They weren't close by any means, but Alex came to understand that Mr. Carter was a man who had once been like anyone else, stable, employed, hopeful. Until life had thrown more at him than he could handle. So when Alex saw Mr. Carter on the news weeks later, accused of stealing groceries from a local store, their heart sank. The reporter's voice was harsh, detailing the charges and showing blurry footage from a security camera. But Alex didn't see a criminal in those grainy images. They saw the man who'd once told them about the job he lost, the family he'd disappointed, and the nights he spent wondering where he'd gone wrong. They couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what the headlines were saying. In the courtroom that day, Alex wasn't even supposed to be there. They had shown up out of sheer impulse, a nagging feeling that they needed to see this through. They sat quietly in the back, their heart pounding every time Mr. Carter was addressed. The prosecution painted him as a repeat offender, someone who had chosen crime over effort. But Alex couldn't reconcile that image with the man they had spoken to, the man who, despite everything, still carried himself with a quiet dignity. When the judge asked if anyone had anything to say before sentencing, Alex hesitated. They weren't a lawyer or a public speaker. What could a teenager possibly contribute in a room full of adults who seemed so sure of themselves? But then they thought about Mr. Carter's face when he talked about his struggles, the way his voice had cracked when he mentioned his daughter and how he hadn't seen her in years. That memory pushed Alex to their feet. "I'd like to say something," they had said, their voice trembling but clear. The judge's raised eyebrow was enough to make them question their decision, but it was too late to back out now. They took a deep breath and began, recounting the small, seemingly insignificant moments they had shared with Mr. Carter. They didn't try to justify his actions or claim he was innocent. Instead, they talked about his humanity, about the struggles that weren't visible on the surface but were all too real. As Alex spoke, the courtroom seemed to shift. The prosecutor's stern expression softened, and even the jurors, who had seemed ready to pass judgment, leaned in to listen. Alex wasn't trying to excuse what had happened. They were trying to remind everyone that behind every headline and every courtroom case was a person with a story. By the time Alex finished, the silence was deafening. They sat back down, their heart racing, unsure if they had done the right thing. The judge sat motionless, their eyes fixed on Alex as if trying to process the unexpected turn of events. Mr. Carter, who hadn't looked up from the table since the trial began, finally lifted his head. His eyes met Alex's for a brief moment, and in them was a mixture of gratitude and something that looked like hope. The gavel still hadn't fallen. The tension in the room was unbearable, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. What would the judge say? Would Alex's words make any difference? Or would the system, as it often does, move forward like a machine, unaffected by the emotions and stories of those caught in its gears? The answers weren't clear yet. But one thing was certain. Alex's act of kindness had sparked something in that room, something that couldn't be ignored. The courtroom wasn't just deciding Mr. Carter's fate anymore. It was deciding whether compassion and understanding still had a place in a world so often driven by rules and consequences. And as the judge finally took a deep breath, ready to speak, everyone braced themselves for what would come next. "Would you like me to keep the suspense building further or move toward any particular direction for the next part?" The judge leaned back in their chair, their expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched longer than anyone anticipated, thick with tension and unspoken questions. Alex's words had stirred something profound. But what impact they might have on the proceedings remained unclear. The courtroom, which moments ago felt like a rigid space governed by rules and procedures, now felt different, alive, almost fragile, as if a single word could tip the balance. The judge finally spoke, their voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. This court has heard many arguments today, but I must admit, the testimony from the young person who just spoke is unexpected. They paused, as though searching for the right words. However, it's also a reminder that there are always layers to a person's story that may not be immediately visible. The prosecutors shifted uncomfortably in their seat. They were known for being tough and unyielding, someone who rarely let emotion sway their stance. But even they seemed slightly rattled. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, trying to regain control of the narrative. "While the testimony is certainly heartfelt, we must focus on the facts of this case. The defendant knowingly committed theft. The law is clear, actions have consequences." Alex flinched at the harshness of the prosecutor's tone but stayed quiet. They had said all they could, and now, the rest was out of their hands. Mr. Carter, seated at the defense table, looked more vulnerable than ever. His hands fidgeted with a paper napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces, as though trying to distract himself from the reality of his situation. The defense attorney, who had remained unusually quiet during the trial, suddenly rose. "Your Honor, if I may," they said, their voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "What the young person said today isn't about excusing my client's actions. It's about context. Mr. Carter didn't steal out of greed or malice. He stole out of desperation. A desperation born from a system that failed him long before he entered this courtroom." This was a bold statement, and it hung in the air like a challenge. The prosecutor opened their mouth to counter, but the judge raised a hand, signaling silence. "Let's take a moment to reflect on what's being said here," the judge said, their tone measured. "It's not often that we hear from someone who isn't directly involved in the case but feels compelled to speak out. It begs the question, are we, as a system, doing enough to address the root causes of cases like this?" Alex's heart raced. They hadn't expected their words to spark such a serious discussion. They had only wanted to give Mr. Carter a chance, to remind everyone that he wasn't just a case number or a headline. Now, they watched as the courtroom began to wrestle with deeper questions about justice, fairness, and humanity. But not everyone in the room was moved by this shift. Among the spectators, a man in a sharp suit leaned toward the person next to him, whispering something with a smirk. He was a local business owner, the one who had pressed charges against Mr. Carter in the first place. His store was where the theft had occurred, and he wasn't interested in hearing about hardships or second chances. To him, the theft was a personal affront, a sign of disrespect that needed to be punished. "Soft-hearted nonsense," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Rules are rules. If we start bending them for one person, where does it end?" Alex caught the man's words and felt a flash of frustration. They wanted to argue, to explain that compassion didn't mean throwing out the rules entirely. But they knew this wasn't the time or place. Still, the man's attitude highlighted the larger conflict at play, one that went beyond Mr. Carter's individual case. It was a battle between two perspectives: those who saw the law as rigid and unyielding and those who believed in its capacity for mercy. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter sat motionless, his face a mask of resignation. He seemed almost detached from the debate swirling around him, as though he had already accepted his fate. But Alex noticed the faintest glimmer of something in his eyes, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. It was fragile, barely visible, but it was enough to make Alex feel that standing up earlier had been worth it. As the judge called for a brief recess to deliberate, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow, feeding off the unresolved questions and clashing opinions. Spectators whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a low hum. Some praised Alex's courage, while others dismissed their actions as naive idealism. Outside the courtroom, Alex sat on a bench, their hands clasped tightly in their lap. They replayed their words over and over in their mind, second-guessing every sentence. Had they said too much? Too little? A part of them wanted to walk away, to disappear from the intense scrutiny and let the adults handle the rest. But another part of them, stronger, more determined, knew they had done the right thing. Even if nothing changed for Mr. Carter, Alex felt they had given him something he hadn't had in a long time: a voice. As the minutes ticked by, Alex's thoughts drifted to the stories Mr. Carter had shared with them during their brief conversations. He had once been a factory worker, proud of his ability to provide for his family. But when the factory shut down, everything fell apart. Job opportunities were scarce, and what little savings he had quickly evaporated. His marriage crumbled under the weight of financial stress, and he found himself estranged from his daughter, the person he loved most in the world. Alex couldn't stop thinking about that daughter. Where was she now? Did she know her father was in court today, fighting for his future? They wondered if she thought about him, missed him, or if she had moved on, shutting out the pain of a broken family. The thought was heartbreaking, and Alex wished there was a way to bring them back together, to help Mr. Carter find a way forward. But this wasn't a movie. There were no guarantees of a happy ending. All Alex could do now was wait and hope that their words had made even the smallest difference. Back inside the courtroom, the judge returned, their face as serious as ever. The gavel was raised slightly, but it didn't come down, not yet. Instead, the judge looked directly at Alex, their gaze piercing but not unkind. "Young person," the judge said, their voice steady, "you've given this court much to consider. Before we proceed, I'd like to ask you one question. What made you stand up today? Why did you feel it was your place to speak?" Alex swallowed hard, the weight of the question pressing down on them. They knew the answer in their heart, but putting it into words was another matter entirely. Taking a deep breath, they stood once more, their voice trembling but resolute. "Because someone had to," Alex said simply. "I couldn't just sit there and do nothing when I knew there was more to his story. He's not a bad person. He's just someone who's been through too much for one person to handle. And I think sometimes we forget how easy it is to end up in his shoes." The judge nodded slowly, their expression thoughtful. The room fell silent again, every eye on the bench, waiting to see what would happen next. "Would you like me to continue deepening the plot or explore additional perspectives in the next part?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Alex's words hung in the air, simple yet powerful, echoing a truth that was hard to ignore. The judge's face remained serious, betraying nothing of what they were thinking. The stillness in the room felt like it might crack at any moment. Even the faint shuffle of someone adjusting in their seat seemed loud against the otherwise perfect silence. Alex, now seated again, felt their pulse pounding in their ears. They had done everything they could, but the weight of the moment was still suffocating. The prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with how much attention Alex's statement had drawn, stood up once more. "Your Honor," they began, their tone clipped, "while this testimony might be emotionally compelling, we cannot allow sentiment to overshadow the facts. The defendant broke the law, and this court must uphold it. Compassion is admirable, but it cannot replace accountability." The words sliced through the air, sharp and unyielding. For a moment, Alex felt a pang of doubt. What if the prosecutor was right? What if their attempt to help only complicated things further? But then Alex glanced at Mr. Carter, who now sat a little straighter, his hands no longer trembling as they had been earlier. That flicker of hope in his eyes was still there, faint but alive. It was enough to keep Alex rooted in their conviction. The defense attorney rose to respond. Their tone was measured, calm, but with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "Your Honor, the law is meant to serve justice, not to act as an unthinking machine. My client's actions, while technically illegal, were born out of desperation. He wasn't stealing to harm anyone, he was trying to survive. Surely, the law must also have room for understanding and mercy." The judge's eyes flickered from the defense attorney to Mr. Carter, and then to Alex. It was clear that the testimony had stirred something, even if their face didn't fully reveal it. But before the judge could speak, a voice came from the back of the room, a voice no one expected. "I'd like to say something," the voice said, hesitant yet firm. Heads turned as a woman in her mid-30s stepped forward, her hands clutching her purse tightly. Alex immediately noticed the tension in her face, a mixture of determination and nervousness. The judge studied her carefully. "And you are?" they asked. "I'm Mr. Carter's daughter," the woman replied, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even Mr. Carter looked shocked, his eyes widening as he turned to see her. It had been years since he had last spoken to her, years of silence that he had assumed would never be broken. The judge gestured for her to step forward, and she did, her steps slow and deliberate. Standing in front of the courtroom, she took a deep breath before speaking. "I wasn't planning to come here today," she admitted, her voice soft but audible. "But when I saw the news about my father, I couldn't stay away. I've been angry at him for a long time, for leaving, for falling apart when things got hard. But seeing him here now, I realize I never really understood what he was going through." Her words carried a raw honesty that filled the room with a new kind of tension. She paused, glancing briefly at her father before continuing. "I'm not here to excuse what he did. But I am here to say that he's not the person this case is making him out to be. He's not a criminal. He's a man who lost his way, who's been trying to survive in a world that doesn't make it easy for people like him to get back on their feet." Mr. Carter's daughter turned to Alex, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "And to the young person who spoke earlier, thank you. You reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. That my father is still human, and that he still deserves a chance." Tears welled up in Mr. Carter's eyes as he listened, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It was clear he hadn't expected this moment, hadn't dared to hope that his daughter might come back into his life, let alone speak on his behalf. The room was electric now, charged with emotions that no one could ignore. The judge's expression softened slightly, though their demeanor remained composed. "This is highly unusual," they said, their voice thoughtful. "But given the circumstances, I will allow it." The prosecutor's frustration was visible, but they didn't interrupt. The courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It had become a stage for humanity itself, where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by the complexities of real life. As the daughter returned to her seat, Mr. Carter turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, the words trembling with emotion. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I know," she replied. It was a simple exchange, but it carried a weight that years of silence couldn't erase. The judge looked around the room, their gaze sweeping over the faces of the spectators, the lawyers, and finally resting on Mr. Carter. "This case has brought to light issues that go beyond the immediate charges," they said, their tone deliberate. "It's a reminder that justice is not always black and white, and that sometimes, the hardest decisions require us to look beyond the surface." The tension in the room was at its peak now, every word from the judge pulling everyone closer to the edge of their seats. Alex felt their palms grow sweaty as they waited, their heart pounding so loudly they were sure the people around them could hear it. What would the judge decide? Would compassion prevail, or would the rigid structure of the law take precedence? The judge raised their gavel slightly, pausing as if to give everyone one last moment to hold their breath. The weight of the decision hung in the air, and for a brief second, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Everyone was waiting to see if this moment would become one of redemption or resignation, of hope or despair. But before the gavel fell, the judge's voice broke the silence once more. "Before I render my decision, there is one final thing I'd like to address," they said, their tone even but filled with gravity. The room leaned in, the suspense now unbearable. What could possibly be left to say? The answer hung in the air, just out of reach, leaving everyone teetering on the edge of the unknown. "Would you like me to continue directly into the climax, or would you prefer to deepen the suspense a bit more before moving toward the resolution?" The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, the tension almost unbearable as the judge's words lingered in the air. Every face was turned toward the bench, each person silently speculating what this final piece of the puzzle could be. Even Alex, who had been so focused on their own decision to speak, now felt a creeping unease. Something about the judge's tone suggested that what they were about to say might shift everything. Before proceeding, the judge continued, their voice calm but commanding, "I must acknowledge a piece of information that has recently come to the court's attention. It seems there's another layer to this case that has not yet been fully explored." They paused, scanning the room, their gaze eventually landing on the sharp-suited man who had been whispering earlier, the owner of the store where the theft had occurred. The man stiffened slightly, his smirk faltering for the first time. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him before he could say a word. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said, addressing him directly, "a new report has surfaced regarding your business practices. Specifically, allegations have been made about how you handle your employees and their compensation. Would you care to comment?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alex's eyes darted to the man, their curiosity piqued. Mr. Carter's daughter frowned, leaning slightly forward in her seat. Mr. Whitaker's face turned a shade paler, but he quickly recovered, his voice dripping with indignation. Your Honor, I don't see how that's relevant to this case. This trial is about theft, not my business. The judge's expression didn't waver. Relevance is for this court to decide, they replied firmly. And according to the report, you've been involved in wage disputes with multiple former employees, including the defendant, Mr. Carter. The room fell into stunned silence. Alex's mind raced as the revelation sank in. Mr. Carter had worked for Mr. Whitaker? How had that detail gone unnoticed until now? They turned to look at Mr. Carter, whose face was a mixture of shock and weariness. He nodded faintly, as though finally understanding why everything felt so deeply personal. The defense attorney seized the moment, rising to their feet. Your Honor, this information is critical. If Mr. Carter was once employed by Mr. Whitaker and faced unfair treatment, it adds significant context to his actions. It suggests that this theft wasn't just an act of desperation. It may have been rooted in a sense of injustice. The prosecutor, clearly caught off guard, scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, even if this is true, it doesn't change the fact that Mr. Carter broke the law. Whatever grievances he may have had should have been addressed through legal channels, not through theft. The judge tapped a pen lightly against the bench, their eyes narrowing as they considered the arguments. The law must account for the full picture, they said. If the theft was motivated by more than just desperation, if it was a response to systemic mistreatment, it raises questions about the fairness of this case. Mr. Whitaker's composure cracked further. This is ridiculous, he snapped, his voice rising. I run an honest business. If Mr. Carter had a problem, he could have taken it up with me instead of stealing like a common criminal. Alex felt anger flare in their chest. It wasn't just the words Mr. Whitaker used. It was the way he said them, as though Mr. Carter's struggles were beneath his notice, as though he couldn't imagine ever finding himself in a similar position. Alex clenched their fists, fighting the urge to stand again, to say something. But before they could act, the judge spoke once more. Mr. Whitaker, they said, their tone sharper now, I would remind you that this is a courtroom, not a place for personal attacks. If these allegations against your business are true, they may have significant implications, not just for this case but for your own legal standing. The tension in the room escalated further, the dynamics of the case shifting dramatically. Suddenly, Mr. Carter wasn't just a desperate man trying to survive. He was potentially a victim of exploitation, someone pushed to the edge by forces larger than himself. The narrative that had seemed so straightforward, thief and victim, crime and punishment, was now far more complex. As the judge called for another brief recess to allow both sides to review the new information, Alex stepped outside into the cool air, their thoughts spinning. They hadn't expected this twist, hadn't imagined that Mr. Whitaker might have played a role in Mr. Carter's downfall. It was a reminder of how messy and complicated life could be, how rarely things fit neatly into black and white categories. Mr. Carter's daughter joined Alex outside, her expression troubled. Did you know? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you know my dad used to work for him? Alex shook their head. No, but it explains a lot, doesn't it? Why he seemed so broken. It wasn't just about losing a job, it was about losing dignity, too. She nodded, her gaze distant. I always thought he gave up too easily, that he didn't try hard enough to pull himself together. But now, I don't know. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe he never had a real chance. The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Alex wanted to say something comforting, something that might make her feel less conflicted, but they knew there were no easy answers. All they could do was wait, just like everyone else, to see how the rest of the story would unfold. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged than before. Spectators whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Mr. Carter and Mr. Whitaker. The two men sat on opposite sides of the room, yet the invisible thread that connected their lives was now impossible to ignore. As the judge returned and called the court to order, Alex braced themselves, sensing that the stakes had never been higher. Whatever was about to happen next would change everything. The courtroom fell silent once more as the judge's gavel struck sharply, calling everyone to attention. The weight of what had been revealed hung heavily in the air, and every person in the room seemed to lean forward, waiting for what would happen next. Alex's heart raced as the judge's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Mr. Whitaker before settling on Mr. Carter. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, their tone measured but with a tinge of empathy, "this court has been presented with a case that is far more complex than it first appeared. While the facts of the theft are undeniable, so too is the context in which it occurred. You were not simply acting out of desperation but in response to circumstances that this court cannot ignore." A flicker of hope lit up Mr. Carter's face, but it was tempered by the weight of his years of hardship. He nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you, Your Honor." It was clear he wasn't expecting a miracle but was grateful for the chance to be truly seen. The judge then turned their attention to Mr. Whitaker, whose discomfort was palpable. "As for you, Mr. Whitaker," the judge continued, "this court finds the allegations against your business practices deeply troubling. While they do not absolve Mr. Carter of his actions, they do provide critical insight into why this incident occurred. Justice does not only apply to those who are accused, it applies to everyone, including those who hold positions of power." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Mr. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. "Your Honor," he stammered, "I run my business fairly. These accusations are baseless." Before the judge could respond, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom, cutting through the air like a knife. "That's a lie." All heads turned to see a former employee of Mr. Whitaker standing up, their expression resolute. "I worked for him too. He underpaid me, docked my hours without cause, and fired me when I tried to speak up." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the room. Alex glanced at Mr. Carter, who now sat with a mix of disbelief and vindication on his face. The judge raised a hand to restore order, their expression grave. "If these allegations are true, Mr. Whitaker, they will have significant consequences. But for now, we must return to the matter at hand." The focus shifted back to Mr. Carter, and the judge's tone softened. "Given the circumstances, this court finds that a purely punitive approach would not serve justice. Mr. Carter, you are hereby sentenced to a period of community service, during which you will work with local organizations that provide aid to those in need. Additionally, I will be ordering an investigation into the claims against Mr. Whitaker's business." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Alex felt their chest loosen, the tension finally beginning to ease. But just as it seemed the case was reaching a resolution, the final twist came. As the judge prepared to dismiss the court, Mr. Whitaker stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "I won't be made a scapegoat for someone else's mistakes. If you think you can ruin my reputation without proof, you're wrong." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Whitaker, I advise you to compose yourself. Your behavior today has only reinforced the need for a thorough investigation." But before anyone could respond further, Mr. Carter's daughter stood again, her voice clear and steady. "You've already ruined your own reputation, Mr. Whitaker. People like my dad, and others who've worked for you, deserved better. And now, everyone knows the truth." Her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest justice comes from simply bringing the truth to light. Mr. Whitaker's bluster deflated, and he sank back into his seat, his arrogance replaced by silence. As the gavel fell one final time, the courtroom erupted into murmurs, the tension giving way to a mixture of relief and astonishment. Alex turned to Mr. Carter, who was now surrounded by his daughter and a few supporters. For the first time in a long time, he looked like a man who had a future worth fighting for. Outside the courthouse, the cool air felt refreshing against Alex's face. They watched as Mr. Carter and his daughter walked away together, their conversation quiet but filled with a new sense of hope. Alex couldn't help but smile. They had come to this courtroom hoping to make a difference, and while the journey had been far more complicated than they had imagined, the outcome was worth every moment of uncertainty. As Alex turned to leave, they felt a tap on their shoulder. It was Mr. Carter. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "You reminded me that there's still good in this world." Alex nodded, their heart full. "Take care of yourself," they replied. And with that, they walked away, leaving behind a story that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it, a story of resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary power of kindness to change lives. As the courthouse emptied out, the brisk air outside seemed to carry a sense of closure for everyone who had witnessed the day's events. Alex stood on the steps for a moment, watching as the crowd dispersed. Some people lingered, talking in low voices about the case, still processing the twists and turns that had unfolded. Others hurried away, eager to return to their daily lives. But for Alex, it felt like the world had slowed down, giving them a chance to reflect. Mr. Carter and his daughter walked together down the sidewalk, their heads close as they spoke quietly. There was no grand celebration, no dramatic gesture, just the simple act of two people reconnecting after what felt like a lifetime of struggle. Alex couldn't hear their conversation, but the way they walked, shoulder to shoulder, spoke volumes. It wasn't just relief on their faces, it was a fragile kind of hope, the kind that comes when you've been given a second chance and aren't quite sure how to hold on to it. Alex smiled faintly, feeling a sense of pride that they had played a small role in what had happened. They had come to court unsure of what difference their words would make, and yet, somehow, everything had shifted. It wasn't just about Mr. Carter anymore, it was about challenging a system that often failed to see the humanity behind the headlines. It was about giving a voice to those who felt silenced. As Alex turned to leave, they noticed Mr. Whitaker standing by his car, his phone pressed to his ear. His posture was tense, his movements jerky, as though he were trying to keep his frustration under control. For all his bluster in the courtroom, he now looked smaller, less certain of himself. Alex didn't feel pity for him, but they didn't feel triumph either. People like Mr. Whitaker didn't need to be crushed, they needed to be held accountable. And now, with an investigation looming over him, it seemed like that accountability might finally come. By the time Alex made it back to their own car, the adrenaline from the day had started to fade, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. But it wasn't a bad kind of tired. It was the kind that came from knowing you'd done something worthwhile. As they drove home, the events of the day played over and over in their mind, each detail sharpening into focus. The following weeks brought quiet but significant changes. News of the courtroom drama spread quickly, and the community began to rally around Mr. Carter. Local organizations offered to help him get back on his feet, providing resources for housing, job training, and financial stability. His story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, people could come together to create change. Mr. Whitaker, on the other hand, found himself at the center of growing scrutiny. Former employees came forward with their own stories, painting a damning picture of his business practices. The investigation revealed a pattern of exploitation and unethical behavior, and while the legal process was far from over, it was clear that his days of operating unchecked were numbered. The community, once indifferent to his actions, now demanded accountability. For Alex, life returned to its usual rhythm, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. They found themselves more aware of the people around them: the cashier at the grocery store, the janitor at their office, the elderly man sitting alone on a park bench. Each face seemed to carry its own untold story, its own quiet struggles. And Alex realized that sometimes the most important thing you could do wasn't grand or heroic. It was simply paying attention, being willing to step up when it mattered most. One afternoon, weeks after the trial, Alex received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Carter's daughter. Her voice was bright, almost unrecognizable compared to the somber tone she'd had in court. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, "for everything. My dad's doing better now. He's even talking about going back to school to finish his degree. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day." Alex felt a lump form in their throat, a mix of gratitude and humility. "I'm glad to hear that," they replied. "But it wasn't just me. A lot of people came together to make this happen." "Maybe," she said, "but it started with you. You gave him a chance when no one else would." As the call ended, Alex sat quietly for a moment, their phone still in hand. They hadn't done what they did for recognition or thanks, but hearing those words made them realize just how much impact a single act of kindness could have. It was a reminder that change didn't always come in sweeping gestures. It often began with small, seemingly insignificant moments. In the months that followed, life continued to move forward. Mr. Carter found steady work with a company that valued its employees, and he began volunteering at a local shelter on the weekends, helping others who were struggling just as he once had. His daughter, inspired by the journey they'd been on together, decided to pursue a career in social work, determined to be a voice for those who couldn't always speak for themselves. As for Alex, they carried the lessons of that day with them, letting it shape the way they saw the world. They didn't become an activist or change their career overnight, but they did make a conscious effort to be more present, to listen, to step in when they saw someone in need. And in those small acts, they found a deeper sense of purpose. The story of Mr. Carter and the courtroom drama eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by new events and new challenges. But for those who had been there, who had seen the power of kindness and accountability collide, it was a story that lingered. It was a reminder that the world wasn't always fair, but it was filled with people who had the capacity to make it better, one act of courage, one moment of compassion at a time. And so, the chapter closed, not with a dramatic flourish but with a quiet, enduring hope. The kind that wasn't flashy or loud but was all the more powerful because it was real. It was the kind of hope that reminded you that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a chance to rewrite the ending.